the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says to his followers, "You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." To some readers, Jesus' claim sounds wild. Is it possible that in order to elevate his own status as a great moral teacher, Jesus exaggerated or maybe even intentionally distorted how others defined justice? In this video, I'll show that Jesus didn't exaggerate or distort. Rather, in Jesus' day, just as it is in our day, there were at least two views of justice, and only one of those is compatible with the character of God and the biblical Christian worldview. For the ancient Greeks, Themis, the daughter of heaven and earth, was the goddess of wisdom. The scale of justice represented her good counsel that brought order to society. For philosophers like Simonides and Thrasymachus, justice meant doing good to friends and harm to enemies. Justice meant taking power from the weak to protect the interest of the stronger. The only injustice these men could imagine was lacking the power to enforce their will on others. This is the context for Jesus' own countercultural teaching about justice. For the Romans who ruled over the Jews, moral goodness aligned with the popular Greek ideal of justice and was achieved only when they had power to help their friends. Which doesn't sound all that bad, except justice also meant the power to harm their enemies like the Jews. Roman justice meant the power to conquer the weaker nations and oppress the non-citizens. The scale of justice, the difference between good and evil, was therefore measured in power. This takes us back to Jesus. Let's read the full context of what he had to say about God's justice and why it was so different than Greek justice. Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rains on the just and on the unjust." God's justice, according to Jesus, demands that his followers do good works because God does good works. God's justice demands doing good without prejudice. Even more radically, God's justice means showing kindness even to those who seek to oppress you. This moral standard of goodness shows us that God's foundation for justice was not power, but something completely different. But I'll leave that discussion about the foundation for God's justice for another video. For now, let's focus on these two views of justice: Greek justice, which is doing good to friends and harm to enemies, versus God's justice, which undermines the social justice power structures and is often called the golden rule. And as you wish that others would do to you, do so to them. From this quick study, it's easy to see that Jesus was not inventing a straw man definition of justice when he said, "You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." He was creating a necessary contrast between the Greco-Roman social systems of justice and God's transcendent system of justice. Now, if you are a Christian in pursuit of justice today, keep these 4 guidelines in mind. First, don't read our cultural values back into the Bible. Second, don't redefine biblical words according to modern definitions. Third, don't give in to the temptation to fight injustice with more injustice. Fourth, not everything that is good for the Christian should be written into the law of the land. For example, in some of the early American colonies, there were laws that required everyone to go to church. It was a bad idea then and a misunderstanding of biblical justice. Finally, go back and compare these two systems of justice and discuss these 3 questions. 1. Based on the word of Jesus, what is the foundation for God's scale of justice? I'll give you a hint here. It's not power. 2, which form of justice, Greek justice or God's justice, do you see lived out by your friends, your enemies, and our politicians? What are some examples? 3, and this is where the question gets a bit more personal, what is the definition of justice that guides your moral decision-making and your political decisions? Is your definition of a just society closer to Greek justice or God's justice?